We have 4 papers, so each of you get 15 minutes. I mean, we don't have to be dictatorial about it. We have a small audience of 1 so far. So Azda, you're really under pressure to not leave us, because otherwise we'll have no one. Um, hopefully more. Oh, there's also Christopher Schultz. So hopefully we'll have a bit of discussion at the end. So 15, 16, 17 minutes, I'll keep time and I'll wave things at the camera halfway, and yeah. I guess we stick with the order of papers listed on the program, which is Jessica Hope, Vania Licio, Emiliano Cabrera Rocha, and John Barnes. This is the second panel of this topic. If you missed the first one, I think it's recorded. So I recommend that you go back and watch that too, because it was a good panel. Without further ado, I think I'll just kick the ball to Jessica.
Okay, so thank you, Murat. Yes, my name is Jessica Hope. I'm at the University of St Andrews. This is the paper I was going to present this morning, which is called Driving Development in the Amazon, and builds on exciting work by Charlotte Lemansky on infrastructural citizenship, sort of arguing for the ways we could extend that with political ecology to think about the way that sort of human, non-human relationships are governed by infrastructure and states. However, I'm going to present a completely different paper today, and just ask you all to go and find this and read it, because I'm having a baby on Friday and I have a paper that is so close to being submitted, and I realized it would be much more helpful to present this other paper and get all your thoughts and feedback so that I can submit it before having a baby and then never think about it again. So the paper I'm going to present is called Critiquing Sustainable Development from its Material Geographies. As everyone here at this conference will know, sustainable development is a really old concept and much critiqued and much derided, actually, as kind of vague and insufficient as an environmental agenda. But despite that, since 2015, it has been the guiding framework and concept of this global and globalizing agenda for led by mainstream development actors, Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of a suite of global policies aimed at responding to climate change. This is happening at the same time as people like Emma Maudsley and Ilya Salami, Glenn Banks, Jack McTaggart are writing about shifts in global development, shifts that are securing, are meaning that global development is no longer kind of bordered and influenced by the private sector and capitalism, but actually inhabited by it, that there is an increasing financialization of development that is resulting in big shifts in how development projects and policies are being written and how development is being achieved. And as part of this, hard infrastructure and commitments to infrastructure-led development are becoming a key development geography. So in this paper, what I'm arguing is that these kind of shifts necessitate a change in how we engage and sort of define and frame sustainable development, and that we should shift from predominantly assessing sustainable development as a shifting discourse and think about it from these emergent material geographies that are being laid down by commitments to hard infrastructure. And I'm going to do that today by focusing on the Amazonian region of Latin America and commitments to major transport mega infrastructure. And really what I'm arguing is that looking at sustainable development from its material geographies, yes, in some ways it just strengthens existing critiques about the alignments between sustainable development and business, but it also shows us or reveals the work being done beyond the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals and the work being done by sustainable development as a kind of global environmental narrative and its impacts on other environmental alternative politics. So this map here is from Tony Bebbington and others' recent paper about governing large-scale infrastructure in the tropics. And what it shows is these hugely ambitious plans for transport mega infrastructure across the Amazonian region, and the ways that these cut across and through heavily forested areas, conservation areas, indigenous territories, as well as sites that are rich in resources and very important for the region's political economy that's dependent on resource extraction. What these new commitments to transport infrastructure in terms of like roads, bridges, dams, mines, sites for export ports, they build on existing commitments to infrastructure seen in the IIRSA and COSI plan model, and that have been critiqued as primarily about resource extraction and global markets. But actually what's different about these recent plans is that they are being framed as central to sustainable development and achieving the sustainable development goals. So people like the UN, multilateral development agencies, states are claiming this infrastructure as central to closing Latin America's infrastructure gap and being the kind of foundational infrastructure for achieving sustainable development in the region. So I don't think anyone is claiming that roads are environmentally sustainable, but it's just the basic first step in a kind of development plan of achieving the SDGs. And saying that, there is also SDG 9, which is absolutely committed to new infrastructure, including hard infrastructure. And if you look at the indicators for target 1, the first indicator is about the proportion of a population that lives near to a road. So roads are being pitched as foundational to this vision of development, despite contradictions around sustainable development. So, and there has been work already that has shown that, you know, like people like Tony Bebbington actually have done a lot of work with others around looking at the deforestation and environmental degradation caused by road building projects in the Amazon and elsewhere, and also, you know, building on what we talked about yesterday, pointing us to the fact that this is mega infrastructure. We're not talking about locally negotiated access roads. We're talking about major highways being built that are hugely environmentally destructive and damaging. So I think empirically, you know, Latin America as a case shows us what we know, which is that this kind of large-scale infrastructure is environmentally unsustainable. What I want to look at in this paper is what more theoretical treatments of infrastructure offer to our engagement with sustainable development. So how do social science treatments of infrastructure extend how we engage with the term and concept and work being done by the Sustainable Development Agenda? And I'm going to sort of draw on 3 things. So the first is work that looks at infrastructure as lively, as something that has political agency and that has an effective force in a place. Work by Jane Bennett, for example, who's looked at the political ecology of things, you know, and looking at the way that political ecologies and the way that places are governed are changed by material objects and materiality, and in this case, roads. Or Andrew Barry, who's looked at pipeline politics and the way that those sorts of pipelines gain political power through knowledge. So the first is thinking about the way that these roads actually have political agency themselves and change the way that areas are governed, change the political ecology of a place. The second is work that I find totally fascinating, but too often cordoned off within urban geography around infrastructure and citizenship, that looks at sort of the politics of, or claims, often looks at the claims for hard infrastructure, like claims for roads, claims for electricity, claims for the provision of basic infrastructures as negotiations of citizenship, for example, in informal settlements. So Charlotte Lemansky has led on work that is looking at the ties between infrastructure and different forms of citizenship, and Ashamin has looked at hard infrastructure as a kind of political intermediary that can help people claim rights to the city. I find this work really, really interesting, but I think in rural spaces and around sort of different kinds of environmental knowledges and politics, it needs to be differently inflected. And then the third is a kind of emergent body of work that thinks about infrastructure. I've put the environment, but maybe better would be non-human or plural ontologies of the non-human. But Charis Enns, who presented yesterday, has written a paper, co-authored a paper in Annals around arguing that, you know, work on infrastructural violence by people like Tanya Murray Lee needs to think more about the violence being done to more than human populations, and that actually too often infrastructure is seen as happening on nature as a kind of static backdrop, rather than thinking about the kind of violence being done to more than human populations. In the paper that I was going to present, I've been looking at infrastructural ecological citizenship. So the way that people place relationships, for example, Emiliano in the TIPNIS, different ideas about the way that people in place could be, you know, governed and brought into state policy, the way that that is disciplined by big infrastructure projects, which is about state, but it's also about transnational forces. And Mambarua has recently published a paper in Progress in Human Geography, thinking about a kind of widening the ontology of how we think about infrastructures, to think about mobility of non-human actors, and how you know, wildlife as co-constitutive of social life is being changed by these infrastructures too. So I think these kinds of treatments of infrastructure help us get at the way that sustainable development is being changed by its material geographies. But I think they can also be strengthened, especially in Latin American case, by Latin American debates around political ontology. I think it shows some of the kind of who cares of why we might worry about this kind of stuff in terms of what roads might be doing and where. So in Latin America, there's also these very fertile debates around political ontology and the politics of different kinds of knowledges and where they are sort of developing and coming from. So Boaventura de Sousa Santos has written about the knowledges of the global south, knowledges from resistance. That maps quite a lot onto work that's happening around territorial politics and the kind of possibilities that territorial sovereignty offer for different kinds of political politics and world making. There's a lot of work happening on the pluriverse and kind of work to recognize different worlds and to kind of accommodate or create a world where many worlds fit. But the issue is that these big roads are coming through these very spaces and places where some of these ideas and politics are being developed. Okay, so how do these come together to help us think about sustainable development? I think it does a few things. I think, first of all, it helps us see that sustainable development involves violence, you know, that there's a violence to these sorts of infrastructure projects that go beyond the targets and indicators being recognized by the SDGs. There's a violence happening to places and also to non-human populations where this big mega infrastructure is being rolled out. But also that the hard infrastructure of sustainable development has its own political agency, and has its own political agency that's changing the political ecology of these spaces where these roads are cutting through. And that includes in terms of the ways that, and this is also something that we talked about, the different ways that logics, that groups and communities and leaders are coming into contact with differing logics and politics and actors of development, and how those are being taken on in places where there might be alternatives to development that have been so far broached. And I guess the third thing, perfect, I am finishing. The third thing is that these new material geographies of sustainable development are territories of becoming, in terms of the fact that, you know, the political ontology literatures help us see these spaces as important to knowledge production and place-based political projects. And that actually thinking about sustainable development through these kind of material geographies is partly about trying to understand how changes to territorial politics, to knowledge making, to future making are happening through these kinds of new material landscapes. and thinking and questioning how new mega infrastructure is disrupting and undermining the places and relationships that are elsewhere being looked at as crucial to enacting alternative trajectories of sustainability. So in conclusion, I can only actually read half of my conclusions because of your photos. Oh no, there we go. So in conclusion, what I'm arguing is that Agenda 2030 is more than a discourse. It's more than discrete goals and distinct projects. It's also becoming a material endeavor that is being enacted through commitments or this wider paradigm shift to infrastructure-led development. And that when you take those kind of processes together and use these social science treatments of infrastructure to think about what the material geographies of these new roads are doing, you reveal a process of reassembly, which is supporting this kind of creeping hegemony of capitalist inhabited development. And in the case of the Amazon, is reassembling places and spaces that are simultaneously being looked to as crucial for articulating and mobilizing alternative social environmental trajectories. So it's lessening and narrowing these possibilities for alternatives. So I think in some ways this adds to existing critiques of sustainable development as a project that's very private sector business friendly, but it also extends how we see the work being done by sustainable development beyond the goals, beyond the specific goals and indicators and targets of the SDGs, but actually as an environmental agenda, how is it playing out elsewhere in ways that's narrowing these possibilities? And I think it also speaks to debates within sustainable development where there's still engagement with it from more progressive forces who are claiming that we should, for example, as critical geographers or development scholars, engage with the SDGs as kind of like the best framework we're going to get or the best opportunity we're going to get, or try and shift the discourse to be more around justice or environmental justice. And whilst I'm not arguing that we should kind of reduce the concept to some kind of, you know, reductionist monolithic interpretation, I do think that thinking about this material geography shows limits to what's happening and shows this kind of narrowing of spaces and places in a way that is limiting the spaces for kind of transformative praxis or alternative praxis. And we should think carefully as scholars about where we are situated in that kind of shift. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Perfectly timed. Shall we do the same thing as yesterday and take questions at the very end, pull everything together and have a joint discussion? So great. Then we thank you for that. I already have a question, but I'll hold on to it. We move to the next presenter, Vanya Licio, who will be talking about an entirely different part of the world, and I suspect an entirely different methodological setting. So, Vanya, the floor is yours.
Yes, I try to share my screen. So, sorry. So good morning to everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about this new research about navigable rivers and transport infrastructure in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm Vanya Licio. I'm a postdoc researcher in the University of Siena, the Department of Economics and Statistics. And I'm really happy because this is the first time that I present this research. So basically, this is a really new working paper. And it's also a new field for me because I don't do research on development. I don't do research on low-income countries or on Africa. And today, I'm really happy to share with you this research because I'm really interested in understanding whether this idea could be interesting, if this idea could have a potential, or if it makes sense. So basically, I'm really interested in understanding whether it could be interesting. So basically, I start because the research is really long, so I try to stay in my 15 minutes. Everything starting when I saw this map. So this research started from a curiosity. I saw this map of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and of the Congo Basin. So here we have the Congo, and we have the Congo River and all these rivers and small tributaries of the Congo River that cross the country. And two questions arising in my mind. So basically, the first question was basically this dual nature of the navigable rivers. So there is a literature in economics that explain how this geography is important for development and trade. And here we have important work of Diamond in 1997, also Nan and Puga 2012, but also Gallo-Sachsen-Mellinger in 1999. And this literature underlines how many geographical features like being landlocked, being remote, or having a tropical climate, but also having rivers could represent a barrier to economic activity. Here I'm talking about economics. I'm not taking into account now the environmental aspect of the river. So basically, if we think to the Congo, so here we can see that the Congo is a landlocked, it's not a landlocked country because it has a really narrow portion on the Atlantic Ocean, long only 35 kilometers. But we can think that the Congo as a landlocked country. It has a tropical climate and is crossed by many, many kilometers of rivers. So we have navigable rivers that have this double nature. They are a geography, a pure geographical element, what is called in this literature first nature geography. But on the other hand, we can think of the navigable rivers as a transport infrastructure, so a second natural geography. So we have this dual nature. And to my knowledge, this dual nature of the navigable rivers has still not been considered in the literature. So on the one hand, we have this geography that could represent a barrier because it can impede the development and trade because it's a barrier in the construction of the main transport infrastructure. So having rivers and if you need to construct railways and roads, this could be a barrier because you need bridges, viaducts, and other infrastructure. So you need money, and this is not so trivial for countries like low-income countries like Congo, where you need money to construct the infrastructure to overcome this barrier. On the other hand, however, the navigable rivers can be seen like an advantage because it facilitates development and trade. And historically, we know that, especially in Europe, this was really important for the trade and development, and also for the development of cities. So the main cities in Europe have a river. So here we have this dual nature. So but I have also another research question, and basically this work is focus on two different research questions. One is the navigable rivers of this first versus second natural geography. So the question is, do navigable rivers represent a burden or an opportunity for the Congo? And we should think about the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a low-income country, has a lot of problems from a military, institutional, political point of view. So it's not so an easy country. It's really a specific, a particular country. So assessing the effect of navigable rivers in a country like Congo is not so trivial. On the other hand, the navigable rivers interact with the main transport infrastructure, or at least in the Congo, we have this kind of three-modal transport network where rivers, railways, and roads constitute a three-modal transport network. In order to try to answer these two research questions, so basically the double effect, the dual nature of navigable rivers, and how navigable rivers interact with the main transport infrastructure. And when I say main transport infrastructure, I mean railways and paved roads, something that is constructed. I try to focus on the relationship between this natural main transport infrastructure. I use a 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells and only geocoded data. So basically everything here is empirical, comes from data. And then also I look at the importance of rivers for economic development. So I look at the mining activity, on the cropland production, and on the nightlife luminosity. I'm not taking into account, at least for the moment, on the environmental benefits of having navigable rivers or the benefits of the Congo River and the surrounding of the neighborhood of the Congo River, that is the rain port. What are the motivation behind this work? So basically, historically, water was important for transport of goods and people, and especially in developing and underdeveloped world like the Congo, this key historical role holds. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, navigable rivers represent 60% of the total main transport infrastructure. So it's really an important transport infrastructure for the movement of people and goods in the Congo. On the other hand, the Congo has this very peculiar organization of its transport infrastructure because railways, paved roads, and navigable rivers constitute its intermodal transport system. And the interesting part of this research is that, or maybe of the Congo, is that where in the places where you have a river, you don't have railways, you don't have paved roads. or when the navigable rivers is interrupted by waterfalls or rapids, so you cannot navigate the river, the continuity of the network is performed through railways and roads. However, there are some challenges with this research. One is the data availability. So basically, since I said Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world with a lot of military, institutional, and political problems, there are not extensive data. So basically, it was difficult to find data to try to assess or try to understand this research question. And so I used geocoded data. And then the second challenge is the dual nature, and it's more about the identification strategy. So how to distinguish the geographic nature of the river from its transport function? How to distinguish the first geography from the second geography? And the third challenge is the zeros. I have a lot of zeros. So 91% of the Congolese territory has not a main transport infrastructure. So it's not crossed by railways and by roads, paved roads, because it has heavy truck roads, but they are not paved. So as I said, there is not a literature on the dual role of rivers. This work can be, however, linked to different strands of the literature, so on geography and economic activity, transport, infrastructure, development, and trade. So there is a lot of work on the positive effect, or also from an historical point of view, on the persistent effect of the transport infrastructure on development and trade today. But it can also be linked to the literature on bad geography and poor infrastructure, or in the transport infrastructure in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we have many interesting work about the World Bank, but also the Bengu and co-authors, and Germania and co-authors. So these are the railways in Congo. So the majority of railways were constructed during the colonial era, so at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, by the Belgian colonialists, and they were constructed for economic purposes. So they want to exploit the natural resources that were in the Katanga region, especially. So the Katanga region is in the south east of the Congo. And today, the railways are in a dilapidated condition, because all the railways that are today in Congo are the ones that were constructed by the Belgian colonialists. So basically, the railways that we have today that are really in a dilapidated condition are the railways that were constructed by the Belgians. Sorry. Also, the paved roads are in a very bad condition. Only 2%, I will say, of the entire network. They represent only 1.5% of the entire roads, and these are mainly not paved roads, because the paved roads are really also the paved roads are really in a very bad condition, or are dilapidated condition. And then we have the navigable rivers. We have more than 50,000 kilometers of navigable rivers. 4,000 are represented by the Congo rivers. The other are represented by the tributaries and other small rivers. And the interesting thing is that many cities, main important cities like Kisangani, Badundu, are linked to the capital Kinshasa only by the river. So you need to use the river to arrive to the capital. So you cannot use only railways on only roads, or only a not paved roads. So basically, you need to use the river to arrive to the capital. However, the river is not so it's not so easy to use, because it's relatively slow, and during some months it's not navigable. So you have a very long time that you need to wait for the ship, and so it's not so a very comfortable transport infrastructure. Here is my main slide. So basically, it's about the identification strategy, how to study this research problem. So basically, we should take into account, this is really important in economics, that navigable rivers can be considered exogenous, because they are there, they not depend on economics, so they have not been constructed for economic purposes. On the other hand, you have railways and roads that are endogenous, because they are constructed to exploit natural resources in Congo, or to reach some areas that are important from an economic point of view, so basically because they are rich. However, in Congo, the endogeneity of the railways and roads is not so really a big issue in my opinion, because both railways and roads are strictly linked to the river course. So basically, they are a complement of the road, of the river, sorry. And also, they were constructed where there was not the river. So basically, in the Katanga region, there was not river. So basically, they needed to construct something in order to arrive there. But also, there is a question that I was thinking about: where would railways and roads have been constructed if the river was not present? And in order to try to, okay, 5 minutes. In order to try to answer you to all these questions, I try to select some areas. So in order to not have so many zeros, or in order to have a kind of exogenous framework, in order to assess the effect of navigable rivers and mainland transport infrastructure on the 3 different economic outcomes that are mining activity, crop production, and nightlight luminosity. In the case of the mining activity, I look at the Precambrian rocks area. It is the area that is known, that is the oldest area in the Democratic Republic of Congo that hosted, is rich of mineral resources. I will go up. So this is basically the Precambrian rocks area. So basically, you are talking about this orange area. So I focus on this area for the mining activity, but also I also take into account the last quintile of the distribution from the cropland production, and I also say that I use only geocoded data, so everything comes from geography. And I have divided the Congo in in more than 24,000 cells, 10 by 10 kilometers. So this is basically the map of the Congo. On the left, we have I have mapped the nightlight luminosity, and we can see there is a kind of correlation between the nightlight luminosity that are these more light areas, so basically the yellow and the red ones, and with the Precambrian rocks area. So basically, there is a kind of correlation. And here we have, on the left, I mapped the mining zone and the mining sites, and then we have also the railways, the roads, and the navigable rivers. However, since I have only 5 minutes or less, I think, I will go quite fast, and I will show you some estimations, just in order to show you how I try to assess or to investigate this problem. The first was to understand which is the effect of navigable rivers on the mainland transport infrastructure. So the question is, navigable rivers as first natural geography play an effect on the construction of railways and roads. So in order to understand this, I take into account for each cell whether there is a navigable rivers in the surrounding, and whether this has an effect on the presence of railways and roads. And basically, there is a kind of navigable rivers have an effect on the presence of railways and roads, but because, as I said, and also how we can see from the maps, navigable rivers, railways and roads have been constructed as a prosecution of navigable rivers. So it's quite it's okay. So it basically it makes sense that navigable rivers have a positive effect on the construction of railways and roads, because this transport system is basically an intermodal transport system. So it's thought as a three-modal transport system. The second was to understand whether navigable rivers have an effect on the mining activity compared to the man-made transport infrastructure, and the answer is, for the moment, no. Or basically, it has a negative effect on the mining activity. So basically, the mining activity does not have an advantage for having a navigable rivers in the neighborhoods. On the other hand, having railways and roads on the neighborhoods have a positive effect on the mining activity. So on the mining production. The same is about the cropland production. So basically, having navigable rivers, and this was quite interesting for me, has not a positive effect on the cropland occurrence. But railways and roads have a positive effect on this cropland production. But what is really interesting is that navigable rivers play a negative effect on the cropland production. effect of roads is something that is also has already found in the literature. So basically, the positive effect that the man-made transport infrastructure has on the cropland production is something that is already found in the literature. But it's something that's more interesting is that this negative effect of navigable rivers on the cropland production, but also on the mining activity. Then I also tried to separate the first geography from the second geography, and I tried to understand which is the different effect from navigable rivers and non-navigable rivers. Basically, there's not so high a really different effect between the two. However, I should say that non-navigable rivers, so the fact that the navigable rivers is only a pure geographical element, is more has more a beneficial effect on the mining activity on the cropland occurrence. I conclude because I also had made a buffer analysis and analysis about travel times in order to try to assess this different effect between man-made and navigable rivers and how they interact. However, I conclude because I need to conclude. So basically, the conclusion is that navigable rivers do not play a positive effect on economic development. So area crossed by navigable rivers show lower levels in terms of nightlife luminosity. And also we have this negative effect of navigable rivers on mining and agricultural activities. And this means that the second geography, so the transport infrastructure, it's like that the first geography of navigable rivers prevails rather than the second geography, the fact of being a transport infrastructure. On the other hand, railways and paved roads, although in a very dilapidated condition, play a positive effect on development. And at the last point is that navigable rivers benefit from the existence of the main transport infrastructure, but the reverse is not true. So the main transport infrastructure does not benefit from the presence of navigable rivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. And we quickly move on to the next paper, which is by Emiliano Cabrera Rocha on the Bolivian TIPNIS case.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share screen now. And do you see my presentation in full screen? Perfect, thank you. Strange thing that I've lost my cursor, my mouse, but that's strange. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I don't know what's up. Well, this has never happened before. Okay, I'll just move it with the keyboard. So, thank you. I will be presenting this paper called Mobilizing Through Nature towards a Hydrosocial Reframing of the TIPNIS motorway controversy. As a context, I would like to share that in this paper, I am exploring if the notion of nature as infrastructure can be enrolled in emancipatory politics. And normally, this idea that seeing nature as green, as natural capital, as ecosystem services, or as green infrastructure raises eyebrows among people in political ecology, a suspicion that I share, because normally this notion is mobilized in wider discourses of neoliberalizing nature or entangling it in processes of capital accumulation. So by contrast, against my own suspicion, today I want to explore if thinking of nature as infrastructure can be enrolled in building solidarity, in this case for the indigenous lowland movement of TIPNIS. I will do a very brief background introduction of the TIPNIS then I will share the concepts that I am thinking through. And in the third section, I will share what I call mobilizing through nature, different framings of the TIPNIS and the motorway controversy through which different actors have mobilized politically. In the fourth section, I will present an alternative framing that I am proposing, the hydrosocial framing of the TIPNIS controversy. And I will conclude by speculating about if nature as infrastructure can be enrolled in solidarity building. So TIPNIS is a territory in Bolivia, in the center of South America, and in orange in the map you can see this territory, TIPNIS, which is the indigenous territory and nature reserve that was first designated as a sans-human nature reserve in 1965 by the military dictatorship, and this erasure of the indigenous inhabitants of the territory became the basis for mobilization. And in 1990, the inhabitants made the government recognize the indigenous sovereignty of the territory. And almost 20 years later, the Morales administration began a project without the consent of the inhabitants to build this road. This sparked a protest, a 600-kilometer march that was violently repressed, but eventually gained massive solidarity from Bolivian population, and it achieved a temporary halt of the project. However, since 2012 onwards, the state has been doing a long-standing dismantling of the solidarities that the lowland indigenous group made, and the road project has been on and off. So just to situate this geographically, the territory is between Cochabamba, a departamento in the center of Bolivia, and Beni, a departamento in the north of the Bolivian Amazon. So while this controversy is obviously about infrastructure insofar as infrastructure is crossing this natural reserve and indigenous territory, the concern of this paper is what are the implications, or what is the potential of thinking of nature or territory as infrastructure. So I invite you to think with me through these two questions. The more specific one is, can thinking through infrastructure help reformulate the TIPNIS controversy in a way that opens up new avenues of solidarity for the lowland indigenous movement? And secondly, can thinking of nature as infrastructure be enrolled in non-market world-making agendas? I will be using the terms framing, infrastructuring, and solidarity quite a lot, so I just wanted to explain a bit how I am using them. The idea of framing has to do with highlighting some specific aspects of a controversy, doing a selection of something and giving salience to this aspect. Through infrastructuring, I prefer the verb to rather than the noun infrastructure, just to think of the processes, both material and performative, to make and unmake and maintain infrastructure. And when I speak of solidarity, I follow Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who proposes that solidarity could be more long sustained when thought through the materialities of everyday life. And in this case, I will think of the materiality of water. So I wanted now to present to you the different framings that through which I interpret how different actors in the TIPNIS controversy have mobilized. I just wanted to ask, can you all see my screen full, or do you see yourselves in my screen?
Just your screen.
Oh, perfect, that's great. I will begin by explaining what I call the hydrological framing. I propose to interpret the dictatorship's designation of the natural reserve hydrological framing, because the dictatorship's aim was to protect the hydrological basin of this area and protect it from road infrastructure in the 60s, and also from colonies expansion. So more specifically, the military junta wanted to prevent flooding and prevent any kind of navigation interference in the area. And I refer to this as the hydrological framing because it really frames the territory as a reservoir of water resources, or as navigable rivers that are useful for the military. This framing is exclusively hydrological, different to the one I proposed, hydrosocial, because it makes no mention of the Tsimane, Mohenyo, and Yuracaré communities that have historically inhabited the territory. And as I mentioned, this erasure became the basis of indigenous mobilization, which I term, I propose that this movement can be seen, like they mobilize through territory, and that's why I call it the territorial framing. Indigenous activists joined forces with other lowland indigenous groups from Bolivia beyond the TIPNIS to demand recognition of the territory. They marched from the Amazon to the seat of government in Highland La Paz. And in crafting this territorial framing, they emphasize the dense or complex relationality of territory. The territory weaves together ecology, spirituality, health, economy, politics, etc. So it is something that Jessica has been mentioning, the territorial mobilizations in South America, and it is really specific to the TIPNIS as well. In contrast to how indigenous inhabitants of the TIPNIS have mobilized through territory, the mass government has mobilized a counter framing that I term the land framing. It is not something that they have explicitly said, but rather it's a tacit framing that I propose in identifying. In this image, you can see in black is the proposed motorway project. What says Polígono 7 is an area inhabited by descendants of Aymara and Quechua migrants from the 60s and 70s, which have their own economies and ecologies around coca production that have produced some kind of tensions and also collaborations between them and indigenous inhabitants of the TIPNIS. So through the land framing, the motorway appears as an instrument to open up space and to turn the discussion of the TIPNIS as a discussion about lands that should be parceled and privatized. And here, it's not only the road that is an infrastructure, but land itself becomes an infrastructure for agrarian small-scale capitalism. So the motorway here is seen as something that will bring progress to the area and advance the development. A different framing, but that is compatible to this one, has been mobilized by critics of the road project who have tried to explain the motivation of the government in the violent insistence of the government in building this road by saying, oh, well, the government is motivated. Like if you see the hydrocarbon pools, the natural gas reserves, they map nicely with the roads, the proposed road that passes through Polígono 7 and kind of far away from the locations of the indigenous communities. So this framing, like critical scholars say, explains that the Bolivian state is collaborating with transnational companies who have the large-scale capital and equipment and infrastructure that can turn the potential value of hydrocarbons, the hydrocarbon deposits that are subterranean, into actual value. But the problem with this framing, I see, it is successful in explaining the motivations of the state, but it also dwarfs, I argue, the political agency of everyday Bolivians, and in particular of the lowland indigenous movement, because the only actors that can operate in the hydrocarbon framing are the state and transnational companies. And furthermore, the resistance to indigenous resistance to the motorway can be framed in this framing as opposition to extractivism or to capitalism, which then pits it as a problem between minorities and majorities, like indigenous minorities impeding the progress of development through extraction, and this can, I argue, that undermines the solidarities that can be built between the indigenous movement and other sectors of the Bolivian population. So far I've shown to you the hydrological framing of the dictatorship, the territorial framing of the indigenous movement, the land framing of the mass administration, and the hydrocarbon framing that critical scholars have, through which they have critiqued the road project. I would like now to propose a fifth framing called the hydrosocial framing. And in hydrosocial, I am following a few authors, where it's Linton and Budd and Berlins, Hochstetter and Swingedow. So let me begin. Thank you. Yeah. As this picture illustrates, water in the form of floods, for example, informs how people live within TIPNIS. And conversely, people's actions also shape the ecologies and landscapes that are shaped by water. Attuned to these intimate relations between humans and water, I propose the hydrosocial framing. This framing reflects that for the indigenous people of the territory, notions of place have a long history of being tied to and constructed through the presence of behavior of water. This framing takes into account that the TIPNIS inhabitants have observed and reported numerous hydrological phenomena that link distant areas and communities both inside and outside the territory. And here I turn again to a map to illustrate this. For the communities living in the TIPNIS have stated that ashes from the slash and burn practices in the top right of this picture in the flatlands of Bennett have been blown into the rivers of the TIPNIS, and they have reported the poisoning of fish. Conflicts among Timanes and Yuracares within the TIPNIS have been reported regarding the use of barbasco, a plant poison used to fish in water that can cause is thought to produce some kind of pollution. But also the TIPNIS inhabitants have reported increasing rates of health problems related to the disposal of chemical residues from cocaine production, and also the colonists' practice of fishing with dynamite upstream in the areas where you see the mountains towards the southern western red border. Additionally, activists and scholars have been reporting the correlation between road building, deforestation, and increased rates of flooding and drought. Here, it is necessary to attend to the flows of water and wind that transport human action. In blue, you can see the water that flows northeastwards into Beni, which is in light green. The dark green part, which is the majority of the TIPNIS, is what the Brazilian geographer Carlos Walter Porto Gonçalves refers to as green oceans of living water. And in the south, you can see in white clouds, which are a really important actor in this hydrosocial framing. When we look at a map, something that appears, you can still see the TIPNIS in the top part of this, the mountains that make the interface between the TIPNIS and Cochabamba. And you can see the Misikuni Dam. And this is a dam that provides water to Cochabamba. What I'm doing here is that through the hydrological framing, I want to, I propose that it is useful on the one hand, because it gives unity to a series of disparate activities by anthropologists, engineers, natural scientists, and other activists that are mobilizing this narrative of the hydrosocial cycle. You can see the map at the top right, where TIPNIS is the region with more pluviosity, with more rain in whole of Bolivia. So there is a place specificity to water here. In the middle, you see a map of cartographers that are illustrating what scientists now call aerial rivers, which is the processes through which the forest is seen as an infrastructure that transports water, thank you, from one place to the other. And this thinking, this hydrosocial framing, not only narrates the nature and water and forest as an infrastructure that moves human activity, but then it makes the motorway or the conflict in TIPNIS be not only about the motorway, but about other infrastructures. Through this lens, the Misikuni Dam is threatened if deforestation continues and these aerial rivers, seen as an infrastructure of transporting water, is dismantled. So as a conclusion, I speculate if it is possible to build solidarity ties through the notion of nature as infrastructure. Through the marches that the indigenous movement has carried out and other kinds of protests, they have, to use the term of de-infrastructuring, have criticized the proposed project of the motorway through the territorial framing. And I think what I want you to invite you to think with me is if it's possible to mobilize the hydrosocial cycle in a complementary way to the territorial framing by seeing the forests as water, as hydrosocial infrastructure that connects the TIPNIS to Cochabamba and to Beni, and in this way to open up solidarity and to make people in Cochabamba and the history of the water wars to be solidarious with the movement for TIPNIS. That's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliano. And we move to our final presenter, John Barnes. If you join the panel in the middle, we'll take questions at the end, right after John's presentation. John, please go ahead.
Cool. Thanks very much, guys. Can everybody see my screen, hear me? Great, thanks. Just going to try and get rid of myself. Okay. Thanks very much, guys. Cool. My name's John. I'm a PhD student at the LSE in the Department of Geography and Environment. And today I'm going to present a paper that I've just finished as part of my PhD. My PhD broadly is looking at how finance funds climate change action. I'm looking at the Green Climate Fund, which is the UN's primary financial instrument funding climate action. And I'm interested in questions of, can it be used to fund climate just activities? And this paper is a deep dive into the justice aspect of it. And specifically, I'm interested in sort of the justice aspects of South Africa's energy infrastructure transition. So I like the look of this panel, and I'm really glad to be participating in it. So yeah, this paper primarily makes a contribution to justice scholarship. And I think I kind of pick up on the sort of climate justice in particular because it's become so mainstream, so common now. It's almost become synonymous with good or like a benefit in a climate change context. And we've reached a bit of an impasse, if you like, where everybody has sort of started saying, yeah, we want to have this just transition. We want to have justice, climate justice. And you've got banks saying it. You've got the president of the country saying it. You've got the activists saying it. And it's a bit of an impasse. And I'm looking to sort of enter that sort of conversation really and try and break the impasse a little bit by asking what can we actually learn about the energy infrastructure transition by emphasizing injustice. Very briefly before we move on, the just transition has become, a bit of a buzzword, and in South Africa in particular, it's almost synonymous with energy infrastructure transition. Here's a quick definition from a think tank that I really like, based in Cape Town. So a just transition is a transition towards a sustainable, low carbon, equitable energy system. So that's quite useful to have in our mind. But as I said, everybody is calling for one. And before we move on, this is just two examples. On the left, we have got a critical academic framework for a just transition. And on the right, we've got, that's a South African researcher. And on the right, we've got big multilateral fund, climate fund, putting out their version of a just transition. So yeah, everybody wants it. No one can agree what to do about it. So I'm drawing on the assemblage concept for this paper. And in general, for my PhD overall, I'm looking to sort of use different aspects of the theory differently throughout in different papers. So I won't spend too much time on this. And thankfully, Jess gave us a bit of an intro to it earlier. So assemblages can explain complex social phenomena. They really are attentive to sort of the coming together of things, that discourses, ideas, institutions, etc. And there's a real emphasis on becoming. I like to think of assembling as a verb, really. And just an important point to start with almost is that they're purposeful, they're productive, they do things, they're not random, they're not just a random collection of things. And this is a really useful quote, I think, from Deleuze and Guattari, who originated the term. Given a specific situation, what kind of assemblage would be required to produce it? So again, they do things. And I won't go into too much detail here, but a really important sort of functional aspect of assemblage as a concept is the interplay between two dimensions. Assemblages have an expressive and a content dimension. So content refers to the things in an assemblage, the ideas, the people, the objects, the things. And expression refers to, say, ideas and symbols and language, etc. So assemblages are made up of these two different things. It's how these interplay, which is really important. And my paper picks up on a bit of a debate within assemblage theory. So the school of thought, the vibrant materialism that Jess introduced, sort of Bennett and Manuel de Landa in particular, very attentive towards about the materiality of situations and ascribe a huge amount of importance to, vibrancy and materiality in assemblage. And that's come in for some critique by Buchanan, amongst others, who accuse Bennett and de Landa of kind of omitting human desire from these assemblages. Human desire, which was central to Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage, so much so they used to sometimes refer to assemblages as desiring machines. So it's desire, human desire, Buchanan would argue, which actually gives the materials their property in an assemblage. And it's especially useful for me to use that kind of framing to think about desire, because I'm looking at justice. It's a normative thing. I want to know how people actually think and feel about these things. So yes, I also look to make a contribution in that sense to assemblage theory, which is quite a lofty ambition. Again, briefly here, a few bits of literature which are quite formative for me. The just transition, again, everyone's talking about it, everyone wants one. This Macaulay and Heffron paper was really useful for me, because often the just transition can get reduced a bit to greenhouse gas emissions and to jobs. And that partly reflects the fact that lots of the research on this is from an OECD country context. It's the UK moving out of its fossil fuel industry. Well, what are we going to do with all those workers? So we need to have a slightly different, more justice interpretation in a global South context, definitely. I also really like the work of Charlotte Lemansky and this idea of infrastructure citizenship, really important in a South African context, in the South African energy context, and her work actually is in South Africa, well, a lot of her work is in South Africa, looking at how that's the state remaking via infrastructure happens, and bringing in some other actors. There's lots of finance actors coming in, including foreign capital, which really complicates the infrastructure citizenship. And then finally, this paper makes draws heavily on effective energy geography, how people think and feel about the energy infrastructure. And there's plenty of literature about how people feel about moving towards renewable energy regimes, or how people ongoing attachments to coal, fossil fuels. So I'll briefly try to give you some key bits of information about the case and how I actually did this, and then spend hopefully the majority of what I've got left showing you some of my data. So I did my research in South Africa. Very lucky, I got to go and do all my data collection before the pandemic. I sort of fled in March 2020 last year with just about enough data. Quite an ethnographic approach, also lots of interviews, lots of document analysis, and this paper in particular draws really heavily on lots of ethnographic work. I joined lots of communities, including policy communities. I spent a lot of time with bankers, solar developers, and a lot of time in mining affected communities. And this paper draws quite a lot on that experience. This, excuse all the words, this is just a bit of a background crib sheet, things you might need to know about South Africa for this to make a bit more sense. In a nutshell, South Africa really punches above its weight with emissions. It's not that big a country, and it produces a third of Africa's emissions. South Africa is the #1 country in the world on the Gini coefficient index list, the most unequal country in the world. So it's got a huge problem of poverty, inequality, unemployment. So there's this real kind of need, if you like, to kind of fix lots of things in South Africa, and the energy transition is seen as a potential way of tagging along some of those ideas. I'm sure lots of you are very well aware, till 1994, there was a white minority rule in South Africa, which ended in 94, Nelson Mandela's new democratic government. And that saw a real concerted drive to sort of electrify the country, to get people on board as part of the development. And that resulted in quite a broad, very wide, but quite shallow electrification. A lot of people got electricity, not very many people had very much. And then also, we had this enormous crisis in the power section, almost daily load shedding when I was there, power outs for a couple of hours, escalating prices, huge dysfunction in the state-owned enterprise monopoly, Eskom, which produces about 90% of power. And finally, you can see here at the bottom, they're committed to 40% renewables by 2030. This transition's happening. It's kind of inevitable, actually. They're legally required as a country to pursue least cost generation options, which is renewables now. And just before I start talking about my assemblages, these two maps kind of demonstrate, if you like, on the left, we've got the coal concentration, enormous coal endowment in South Africa. On the right, we've got kind of a map of where the main power stations are. Just to say that 85% of the value chain is focused in Mpumalanga province, which is where I did a lot of my research. And it's where, of course, we see a huge concentration of the externalities of coal and a lot of injustices. So what I'm going to do now, still got about 6 minutes, is I'm going to sort of walk you through quickly to my two different assemblages. And these assemblages, as I said, they're orderings of human desire. Now, the first assemblage is very specifically about experiences of injustice. And the second is more sort of a general diffuse. It's about justice in like a policy sense more. It's like, you know, it's a bit more taken for granted. More renewable energy equals more justice. Trying to get a sense of what we learn if we disaggregate these slightly. So first of all, okay, this is Masakane, which is a photo of a place I visited a couple of years ago now. This is not totally typical, but it's not unusual in the Highveld, where the coal is, for people to live in these kind of informal settlements near to the power stations. And this is quite, I find this image really shocking. I use it in my teaching as well. These houses, these people here don't have electricity. They live in the shadows of Eskom power stations, and for their energy, they use waste coal. And you can see here, they've got a big pile of the stuff, but it's very dangerous. You know, they're burning very low quality coal in their homes for cooking. So it's a very clear injustice, if you like. And this is just a quote from a trade unionist who really succinctly, if you like, sort of put out the kind of link between electricity and human rights. And this is really, really sort of key to South Africa, especially post-1994. And she says, they say, you know, if you don't have electricity, then you're just not part of the new South Africa. So you see all these really, really strong desires here for participation and modernity. And it's quite interesting, I think there's quite an interesting observation here, which is often energy democracy, energy justice, is quite sort of a localized agenda, whereas in South Africa, it's seemingly different to that. It's like, well, actually, people really want to participate in the state itself. They don't want to be on the outside. There's that long legacy of exclusion. And then another place in Mpumalanga, these photos are from Vosman and in Emelahleni, which literally translate as place of coal in Zulu. And here, this is sort of the absolute epicenter of the coal value chain, loads of mines and power stations. And I had lunch with these two women one day, and really kind of struck me the coal dependency that we see in this place. And it's quite well sort of written about, actually, that lots of people cannot see past it. So these two, they're both actually too ill to work in the mines. They can't get red tickets. These red tickets are these kind of certifications of fitness to work. And they can't work because their lungs are too sick. So again, this sort of grave injustice. But, you know, towards the end of the time I spent with them, they just complained, you know, why can't the government open another mine? There's so much coal here. And, you know, this clear sense that there's a prioritization, right? You know, the desire to actually just have a job and to feed your family completely trumps any of the broader kind of ideas around health, even. So yeah, coal retains this huge sort of fix on people in this place. And this is just quickly a quote from an environmental justice activist in the same town, So I asked them, do people here want renewable energy? And not necessarily. It's quite clear that there are conditions, unless it actually breaks the existing power structure, unless people have some control, again, people don't necessarily want it. So using this kind of assemblage analysis, then, that what kind of conditions are required to actually produce an effect? Well, actually to have this kind of renewable energy revolution, it's not enough just to change the generation source. It actually needs to change the way that people are able to live their lives in these places. And categorically, this person does want renewable energy. That's completely clear. Okay, I'm conscious of time. So then my second assemblage, I won't spend as much time on this one. This is like a much more like general, vague kind of a pursuit of justice, where justice is, justice and the just transition, it's very taken for granted. If you have renewable energy, it's good. And there's strong desires here to electrify the continent, to cover it in solar, because it's good, because it'll help people and it'll reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But then there's lots of issues with this, and there's a clear conflation, if you like, between justice and the energy transition, which some policymakers see as problematic. So I've got a quote here from a very senior policymaker who has this real unease with this conflation, and they liken it to this Zambuk ointment in South Africa. It's this one size fits all. If anything's wrong with you, you just put some Zambuk on, it fixes you. And they're really clear that there is an emancipatory potential for renewable energy. This solar can be the thing which can help people's lives and can reduce emissions and can help South Africa on this development pathway. But at the moment, you just simply can't take that for granted. It isn't actually going to work. And in South Africa, there's lots of social labour plan kind of model where they put, this is key to the just transition. You put some power stations here, the community gets some benefits. So it's far more compensatory. And at the moment, that kind of conflation, unsettles even people who are far more technical or policy minded. And then just to finish, a quick word on solar panels themselves. So again, sort of there's this clear desire, if you like, to just cover the continent in solar. But this isn't going to necessarily fix the problem. Again, it's not necessarily going to help. As we saw in the previous assemblage, there's lots of desires which simply aren't going to be met. And I argue that the problem at the moment is that the solar panels themselves, they're not actually appropriate or semiotically appropriate. The material, the panel, hasn't actually, in an expressive sense, doesn't actually match what people actually want in these places, in the townships. So this is a quote I like from a project developer who, clearly says, communities don't like coal, but they know they've got no livelihood without it. So the key, as far as they were concerned, was, well, we've actually, the solar panel needs to become appropriate. It needs to be semiotically appropriated by people, has to become relevant, has to become essential to people living in these townships. So again, quite a different sort of approach, but you can see how it kind of does match back onto what some people in the first assemblage were actually saying about how coal retains appropriateness at the moment. So to finish, and just over, I think that there's a clear caution that comes out of the assemblage analysis. The second assemblage, which is very much like, well, we need to roll out solar, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It kind of sounds a little bit like sort of net zero kind of narratives, where people say, well, if we cover the country in solar, then we'll have more justice, and therefore that counts as a just transition. And there's this clear kind of sense that sort of net justice approach, but doesn't really address any of the injustice. You're going to leave behind all of the most marginalized people in that context. So it's a huge caution that comes out of my paper against that. And then the second point, the actual material itself, it has the potential to be emancipatory. Solar panels can change people's lives, can be the source of energy these people need. However, the same infrastructure, the same panels, they could just end up being compensatory, which would be rejected. Or it could just be business as usual. It could just replace coal and nobody even notices it. So there needs to be a lot of work done, not for, but with people to actually semiotically appropriate that stuff. And then finally, just to comment on my sort of contribution in terms of the assemblage debate, I think that there's a clear benefit to thinking about sort of human desire and the way that people sort of think and feel about this infrastructure. And however, I mean, it comes out in my paper more than it does here, there's definitely lots of sort of gaps and lots of places where a more materialist approach, it really sort of adds a lot to this conversation, especially as more of this stuff's actually built. So yeah, I'm certainly not sort of siding very strongly on the desire aspect as opposed to the more materialist stance. But yeah, I appreciate that that doesn't come out too strongly here. Anyway, I'll stop. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks, John. Nicely timed also. We have a decent sized audience here. I have questions, but let me not abuse my role as coordinator here to start. Let me see if anyone has any questions. You can type it in. You can raise your hand in the thing on Zoom. You can wave. I think you can also ask questions via the website, Hoover, I think it's called. Basically, we'll take any format as long as it's a question. If not, I will ask them. John has a question. We start with John, and there's also a hand up by, I can't see who, Jessica. John, Jessica, and then I'll sneak in as well.
Sorry to carry on talking. I just had a quick question to Vanya, two actually very quick questions to Vanya, and thanks very much for your really interesting talk. The first one, just a clarification, in what way does the Congo count as landlocked? Because it does have coastline. And the second question is sort of thinking about the non-navigable rivers. I know that there's a huge sort of hydro industry, so I wonder, I know it's sort of slightly outside the range of what you're doing perhaps, but there's such a huge sort of economic value to some of the Inga projects, etc., including selling power to South Africa actually. So I wondered how you thought about the other sort of economic values of some of these non-navigable rivers.
So about I said that it's not a landlocked country, but in reality it's not a landlocked country because it has a coastal access to the Atlantic Ocean. But we can consider like a landlocked country because it is completely surrounded by outer countries. So basically, to trade, so being a landlocked country in economics is really a disadvantage because you need to pay or to cross the border to export. So basically, not having an access to a coast or not having a port, it could be something that is really a disadvantage for you because you need to pay more to export your products. In the case of Congo, since it's a very big country, and from the east and from the west, you have a very huge distance. Having only a little access to the port could be a kind of disadvantage because if you have to go to another direction, you need to cross other countries, so the border, so you need to pay. So basically, it's not so easy to export rather than having a very large access to the coast. So about navigable rivers or not navigable rivers, I just used these non-navigable rivers in order to make a comparison with navigable rivers. So my idea was, but it's really preliminary. So basically, it's something that I started just some months ago. The idea was basically to understand whether, if I consider only the geographic nature of the rivers, not the transport infrastructure, so the transport infrastructure role of the river, whether the fact of being only a river but not navigable has an effect on the economic activity. However, the results are a bit not so clear now to me, so I just presented, but they are not also clear for me because I'm trying to explain why being a river not navigable could be a disadvantage. So basically, I thought it could be an advantage because you can use it for agriculture. However, my results are not so clear. So it seems that when you are a navigable river, it seems it is a disadvantage. But also being a non-navigable river seems to be not also a big advantage or a disadvantage. So basically, it seems that it does not make so much difference between navigable rivers or non-navigable rivers. Instead, about you mentioned the Inga Falls, or I didn't now checked about this stuff. So basically, it's everything geographical, it's everything about data, and so I don't have now information about, so it's really, I don't have an analysis at a local level. So basically, I can also try to focus only on the some parts of the of Congo, like Inga Falls, where we have also the dams. But now it's really very, very general, and it's really, so the part of the empirical part is really now really preliminary. So basically, some results are clear, some are less clear. So I need to do much more research on the stuff.
Thanks, Vanya. We go to Jessica, and then Brock, and then Christopher.
Thank you. I had a question for Emiliano and also a question for John. John, mine is a bit of a crappy question, but it does come from a good place because I have also written a paper with assemblage theory and I'm interested in it and its application. But I was just wondering, in your case studies, what does it do differently than if you were to say, think about infrastructural citizenship, as you're framing for thinking about some of these, things of injustice. And when you're thinking about assemblage theory and injustice, how do you account for power? Because one of the issues I had was how to bring in questions of power into assemblage thinking. And so why is it working better for you? And how are you dealing with power? And my question for Emiliano, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. I was thinking a couple of things. One, I was thinking, in sort of proposing a different way for groups to mobilize, I guess I wondered a little bit about what are the ethics of that as a researcher in terms of how you work with people who are mobilizing around particular issues? Like, what does it mean to suggest a different framing rather than think about how they're framing their struggle? And in relation to that, I think in some ways TIPNIS protesters have mobilized nature as infrastructure, but through conservation, and it's just been very derided. And so I guess I was wondering that too, like, would it help to look at the way that they do talk about nature as infrastructure in terms of kind of like national conservation infrastructure and their role in that, and how that has been downplayed or dismissed? And yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Do Brock and Christopher, do your questions line up with these in any way so that you can go ahead and they're packed, or do you want to wait your turn?
I can better to wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then we go to John, then to Emiliano, but John first.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, I remember actually seeing you talk at the LSE, well, on Zoom. Your talk about where you use the assemblage concepts, which is one of the reasons why I was keen to talk today, actually. So the assemblage concept, yeah, I think it's always really difficult to sort of justify it sometimes, or no, not just difficult. You always have to constantly justify why you're using it. There's basically a handful of things which I find it really useful to do, which I hope are actually different and worth doing. So the first one is using assemblage in this paper does enable me to draw out this distinction of how the same material is different. It does different things, it has different meaning and different concepts. And I think that, as I said, this kind of interplay between expression and content in assemblage, that is something fairly unique to the assemblage concept, especially when we use this sort of emphasis on desire. Like that enables me to say that the same solar panel doing the same thing is actually different and has different sort of implications. And there's also, I mean, I didn't talk about it today, but I tried to develop this sort of spatial justice sort of aspect where I'd use kind of the territorialization sort of bits of the theory as well in the paper. But yeah, sure. I mean, it's always a bit of a battle, I think, trying to justify that you need to use assemblage theory, and hard sometimes not to just use the vocabulary and actually use it properly. Where is the power? So of course we got completely different, actually enormous power asymmetries throughout this, and again sort of assembling as a verb and sort of the process of coming together, then hopefully I demonstrate some of the power by sort of just being able to say, well, here are some of the here are some of the sort of incredibly low resistance sort of ways that these things are assembled, you know, the kind of, like I said, the taken for grantedness of lots of the things which happened in my second assemblage compared to, you know, the sort of the horror stories and then sort of the life's work of people who are sort of represented in the first one, but, you know, really not a lot actually ends up happening. And it came up yesterday actually in conversation, didn't it, sort of the difference between ideas and ideology. And actually, yeah, I think that you know, that first assemblage is really ideological, but then actually you get these ideas in the second one which just kind of walk all over it. So hopefully I can sort of demonstrate power in there. But sure, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a weakness of theory, perhaps, which hopefully I do a decent enough job of addressing. But anyway, thanks very much for the questions.
Thank you.
Emiliano?
Thanks, Jess, for the question. I begin with a small apology because I did get a bit nervous, and I have written a more clear thing than what I said. And in English, it's difficult to me to like improvise kind of. But I apologize because it's really important, and I wouldn't wish to suggest that I am proposing a new way of mobilizing. I am proposing like the concept of hydrosocial framing in order to account for already existing forms of mobilization that indigenous activists, but others too, like hydraulic engineers and natural scientists, have been doing, but have not been accounted for or explained in the literature as activism. What I'm trying to do is come up with this framing, hydrosocial framing, to be able to say, oh, these disparate actions, for example, indigenous people on TV have been discussing the notion of aerial rivers, and indigenous professors have organized in public plazas in Cochabamba to explain what they have learned by collaborating with hydraulic engineers about the role of forests in moving water to Cochabamba and in controlling floods in Bennett. So it is these already existing forms of mobilization and discourse that I want to be able to account for by focusing on the hydrosocial, by saying it is part of the same territorial framing, but one that highlights and gives salience to the hydrological aspects of it, because conservation has been really counterframed by the mass government as something that is egotist, something that, oh, it's a few indigenous people who want to keep their nature, and this is against progress. So what I'm trying to find is ways to better analyze the existing activism that keeps some place specificity to TIPNIS, because water is, like, in particular ways unique there, but something that is not exclusive to the TIPNIS region as the place specificity of conservation is. What I mean is, water is important to everyone, basically, or necessary for everyone, and conservation might not be. There are some people outside of TIPNIS who might not care about it if that threatens their access to cash distribution programs, for example. So I'm just trying to say that the hydrosocial framing is a concept that for us researchers helps us understand more how they are mobilizing through discourses of water. But yeah, thanks for that.
That's really useful, thank you. And I have just thought of a brilliant book that you might enjoy, but as an academic, I can never remember anyone's name, but I'm going to try to remember it and put it in the chat.
Okay, we can go to Brock.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Murat. I was stubborn. I probably could have tacked my question onto Jess's.
Okay.
But nevertheless, this question, so thanks everyone for the presentations. This questions kind of came in response to Jess's and Emiliano's. And basically, listening to it, I was thinking, like, if we recognize that material things have power, right, to like enact violence or forge solidarities, is there a need to sort of categorize and try to understand this kind of hierarchies of power within different infrastructures, including like natural infrastructures? Like, for example, cement and concrete and tarmac are all composed of water, but water also has the power to destroy dams and roads and railways, not to mention like inspire alternative solidarities and forms of citizenship, as you both kind of got at. So basically I'm wondering if like thinking more along these lines could sort of flip how we understand the power of infrastructure on its head a little bit, and maybe lead us to like new insights, not only to like the power of infrastructure, but also the powerlessness of some infrastructure. But I could also be way out to lunch here, so, or someone else could have written about this, which is fine, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Jess, you want to start?
So, well, actually, sorry, I'm going to bounce back a different question again. But so you mean like we would understand better the power of infrastructure if we think about what infrastructure is made out of, the material properties?
I mean, maybe a little less literal than that, but more just like, does a river have the same power as a road? Or does, like, you know, if we're framing material, recognizing there's power in materiality and that a road can be a political sort of actor or agent, like, do we also, could we benefit from kind of making a hierarchy out of that power, trying to understand the different ways, I guess, in more specific terms that the power of a river could be, or a road, or a wildlife corridor, or whatever?
I guess my response would be, I've read some things that are kind of trying to unpack a bit how these things gain power. So I know that Bruce Braun had written a response to Jane Bennett sort of saying, yes, okay, there is some power in bottle tops and rubbish on the street, but we can't sort of equate that with the same power as you know, a state official or the UN. So there needs to be some understanding of different sorts of power. And I guess political ecology is useful for thinking about the way things get power or work within a wider political ecology or sort of governance regime. And I think Andrew Barry too is kind of interested in a more empirical approach to where material objects like pipelines get their power, for thinking about knowledge production, the way that knowledge is produced about pipelines and the way that they get certain power in policy circles at a particular time. But that's the only way I've thought about it till now, I guess.
Thanks, Brock. I really appreciate the question of how to think of hierarchies of power as well. It's something I've been giving some thought to specifically because it would seem, when I was thinking of this paper in terms of how people could mobilize through clouds, basically, clouds seem like very abstract and far away and like literally untouchable, no? But I've been lately thinking through Michel Calon and the concepts of technical democracies. So I think that the idea of power could be unpacked or analyzed through the fora in which power is socialized. So through a hydrosocial framing, for example, there are like really hard power activities such as building the bridges or dams. But in other cases too, like there's a really strange project in Bolivia started by Evo Morales called Operación Lluvia Soberana, like sovereign rain operation, which is to seed clouds in order to fill the dams instead of letting the forests do it. So I would say that the softer forms of natural power or the materiality of clouds can be increased, I guess, by spaces of socialization, by making forum where everyday relations are made visible and not taken for granted. So to really infrastructure soft things as a verb. I hope it was clear, but thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Now we move to Christopher.
Yeah, hello. So I have a question for Jessica, because you mentioned the role of the private sector, but actually there's a question that probably anyone in the panel could answer, even the session conveners. Since the topic of this session is on the global turn to infrastructure, and one thing that is different today, I think, is the increasing role of the private sector, as you mentioned in your talk. And also that is something that makes it different from previous turns to global infrastructure. I mean, it's not new that dams and roads are built today. So I was wondering, although you mentioned the role of the private sector at the beginning, it was not in the conclusions. I was just wondering, in your personal experience in fieldwork in Bolivia or other places, yeah, what can you say? Could you say a little bit more about what the role of the private sector could be there? Because in the own fieldwork that I have done in Brazil, in India, Nepal, I've seen that, yeah, really there is a much bigger role of the private sector nowadays. They are changing the way development is being done, but no one really quite understands what are the implications for that. And although that was not maybe the central point of your presentation, I would be really curious to hear your comments or opinions on that particular bit.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I guess what I should say is that the paper that I'm presenting is a sort of framing for wanting to do fieldwork and a funding application rather than having done it. So I guess in my earlier research in Bolivia and looking at the TIPNIS conflict, actually, I think interest in Bolivia about the kind of radical politics of the mass and the kind of possibilities for a very progressive political regime. And actually, one thing I was asked a few times, including in my viva, was, about the limits to where we can see the ability of the state to make these changes, and the way that contractually Bolivia was beholden to transnational corporations. And I guess in some of my existing work, it's been sort of a slow process of realizing that the, contracts with Shell and Repsol and Total are sort of murky back politics to what's happening. But in this work on the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm increasingly interested in it and led by work by people like Emma Maudsley. I think, are you at Cambridge now? But like she's been writing a lot about, the way that we should, the way that shifts to the way that development is being done is kind of remaking small d, big D categorizations of development. And the way that global development is no longer just kind of funded by the global private sector, but actually inviting private sector officials to kind of drive and shape how development is done. And I think that has just a massive implication for sustainable development, a sort of intensified, enhanced version of critiques from before about the kind of business-friendly ideas about nature and environmental sustainability. So I'm not really answering your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's a crucial framing for how we understand sustainable development and a crucial shift for how we frame our engagement with sustainable development. And I guess what I'm getting at is that these sort of material infrastructure-led geographies as an entry point to thinking about SDGs and sustainable development highlight that kind of private sector engagement with nature and highlight a kind of capitalist understanding of development and lessen the spaces for alternatives, like literally are sort of going into the very places that other people are looking at as these radical places where different alternatives to development might come from. But the shorter answer would be, I want to get some funding and go and look at this kind of stuff.
Yeah, sounds good.
Anyone else want to come in on this? I have something to say, but other presenters, I see some shaking hands. Then I'll ask some questions, and then Vanya still has her hand up. I'm aware.
Yes, but it was the same question of Christopher. Basically, it was the focus on the private sector. It was a question from Jess, but Jess has already answered to the question. So basically, it was about the private sector, so about the private dimension of this sustainable development. So basically, she has already answered. Okay.
Let me also jump in on that question and then ask a round of questions to everyone. About private sector, I think and I think I said this yesterday as well, it changes shape in different places, like in the Ecuadorian context, Correa's move to nationalize the economy, didn't kick private sector out. I mean, you still had Halliburton digging things, building pipelines in the Amazon, but working as a contractor for the Ecuadorian state rather than independently operating infrastructure. So in the Ecuadorian case, you had both intensification of private enterprise, but with a stronger regulation of the state. You also had Chinese companies. There were Chinese corporations, but when you started digging them up, there was semi-state-owned China Railway and Cement Corporation, for example, is doing quite a bit of work. So is there a private entity, is there a state entity? What is the nature of the relationship between them and the Ecuadorian state? I think it needs quite a bit of sort of like disentangling. In the case of Turkey, where I do a lot of work, the state is using state-run sort of like semi-public entities to borrow private capital to build housing infrastructure, and then create mortgages that are basically backed up by flow of American cash into the economy. So these boundaries are being sort of like blurred, but the presence of the state doesn't, I mean, this is sort of like parallels the debate on neoliberalism, that neoliberalism doesn't mean the state goes away. The increased presence of private work in the economy, in infrastructure, doesn't mean the state goes away. I think the regulation changes, but the state is very much in the driving seat in most of these cases. Now I have a couple of questions for everyone, and since we're soon gonna run out of time, I'll keep them quick. To Jess, you know I mean well, so I'm gonna ask a nasty question. I mean, should we not stop using the word sustainable development goals only except in cases where we're critiquing them? But since sustainable development, is being critiqued to death, as you know, and it's clearly being manipulated for all sorts of funny, agendas, should we not give up on it completely and just refuse to use the term in our analytical writing and only refer to it when someone else refers to it? I don't know if this question makes sense. So that's my question to you. To Vanya, I mean, I'm wondering how, if and how you took the colonial history of Congo into account. I mean, the location of roads, location of ports are very much, determined by colonial priorities of what moves and who moved it and how they moved it. How does your model take that into account? And to Emiliano, a question of clarification. I apologize. Once a year I get a migraine, and it's today, so I'm slightly not focused. But I remember in your presentation early on, you said the mass government was sort of dismantling the relationship of solidarity around TIPNIS or something to that effect. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about what's being done and how it's going, and also if you know what's the latest situation there since the election of the new president. That'd be good to know. And finally, to John, I was fascinated by your first assemblage on, I forgot what you called it, I'm sorry, but the first one was more about how people wanted coal and material development. I find that fascinating, and that's much of my work, I think, is now trying to take these demands seriously without reducing them to basic that neoliberal thinking. So I wonder if you are going one step further and trying to understand why and how these desires are sort of like emerging. In the case of Ecuador, we wrote a paper where we explained it basically as a lack of choice. When there's nothing else you can demand, you demand something like this. When you're desperately poor and you don't see any alternative development, then you say, okay, there's coal, so at least let's just take the coal out. So I wonder what your thoughts are about where do these desires come from? So 4 different questions to 4 people. We still have 10 minutes, but more questions coming. So I guess brief answers from everyone.
Okay, I'll go first and I'll be quick. Yeah, I guess in some ways there is a question as a researcher about where you want to devote your time. Is it to something that's being critiqued to death and is still kind of crap, or is it to, more exciting agendas that are kind of being pushed to think differently? But I guess one thing about my engagement, I hope, with sustainable development and the SDGs is because they're all entangled on the ground, and that actually these kinds of infrastructure projects as sustainable development, for example, are going to literally go through and overlap and border the places where other people are writing about these very alternative, sort of slightly bounded spaces for different kinds of knowledge systems and political projects. And so I guess there's a question about, you know, where you want to see change, but what's also happening on the ground in terms of sort of empirical research. And I guess the second part of the question quickly is that even though there's lots of critical social scientists who think sustainable development is rubbish, it's still this term that has incredible traction. I have just become a lecturer in sustainable development at the University of St Andrews in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development, and you're a professor of sustainable development. And it actually surprises me how much people still do engage with the term, you know, that actually it's still, and even really quite progressive groups like all the environmental justice law in Barcelona are still writing papers that engage with it. So I think, yes, sometimes I think, why am I writing about sustainable development and not just putting all my efforts into some kind of amazing new idea that needs work? But the other part of it is it hinges on the fact that actually lots of the work on exciting new ideas that might change the world don't register maybe enough the way that things like new infrastructures are going to reduce those kinds of alternative spaces.
Thanks. Vanya?
Yes, okay, very briefly. So basically, yes, I try to put the historical perspective also on the paper, not to have only a geographical perspective. So basically, I have the map of the historical path at the end of the 19th century, followed by the Belgians. So basically, when they started the exploration of the Congo, they started from the Congo River, and then they explored other parts. So basically, I also would like to put the historical perspective, because in order to understand whether it's random, the fact they arrived in the Katanga region, they find these mineral resources, then they started to construct the railways, or it's something that they explored the other parts of the Congo and they didn't find so easy the mineral resources that are still there, but they are not still found. And so I try to put also the historical perspective in order to understand if it's something random or not random. It's something that is, so they arrived there first, they found the mineral resources, so they decided to construct the railways, but it could be also the other way around. So they did arrive in other parts, they didn't find the mineral resources. So basically it's something that could be also random. So basically I try to put also the historical perspective in the paper, not now, but I have some maps, so I have to now to digitalize the map. So something that took a bit of time.
Go? Okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, one of the most lasting strategies of the state to dismantle solidarities has been to overtake the CIDOB, the Confederation of Lowland Indigenous Groups, which led to the formation of CIDOB Organica, like the bottom-up or the grassroots CIDOB. And even now in the government of Lucho Arce, there still is like a government-led CIDOB, which, as Jessica is better positioned to say, like forms part of this broader campaign of disinformation and muddying the waters of knowledge production to actually know what's happening around the TIPNIS conflict. But just, well, and in another turn of events, it was in the interim government that Janine Áñez issued out a state official apology for the state repression of the TIPNIS and vowed support for that. But now, so the newest development I am aware of is that just at the end of last week, TIPNIS leaders have for the first time formed a new directory of mobilization that includes people from Team Uno, an indigenous territory adjacent in the north of the territory, outside the TIPNIS, but a different indigenous territory. So new formations are being shaped at the moment. So let's see how that develops.
Thank you. And thanks also for mentioning the Operación Lluvia Soberana. I had never heard about it. It sounds fascinating. I'm going to go and read up on it. Just the name makes me, very
Yeah, totally. This idea that there could be grassroots mobilization through what's the hydrosocial framing is interesting. But then I was like, oh yeah, there are also like Bolivian investment in Israeli technologies to seed those things. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, thanks. John.
Thanks very much for the question, Marat. Yeah, this is a really interesting point, I think. The simple answer is that energy is very racialized in South Africa. Most things are quite racialized in South Africa. I mean, so there are 2 points. I mean, first of all, there's a very socialist character still. I mean, it was a very socialist country at the end of apartheid in many ways. There's a huge opposition to privatization, and lots of the renewable energy independent power producers schemes, which are very successful. They're lauded as being really successful. People are very reluctant. It's equated with privatization, whereas coal, Eskom, big infrastructures, like that's the state needs to provide. So there's a lot of opposition in that sense, and people really kind of cling to coal. But also, I mean, again, it's partly sort of the emergence into the new democracy. Coal was seen as a huge endowment for Black South Africans. It's a perfect rent-seeking option as well. So it kind of lent itself to certain people getting very rich. But even still, like for everybody, it was like, well, this is a good energy, an energy source. And then there's this huge sense of unfairness. It's really unfair that South Africa is not allowed to use its coal. So you get people who, perhaps like some of the people I mentioned in my talk, you'll get certain people who are like, this is just ridiculous, open another mine. And then you get activists, they'll say, this is ridiculous. If it wasn't for climate change, which was caused by people in the global north, they're very enlightened in the way they think about this, but it's really unfair. They can't use their coal endowment because of climate change, because people in Europe, etc. So there's quite a lot of attachment still to coal in a number of different ways. And I just wanted to sort of really quickly say something else as well on the subject of private sector. It's not got anything to do with this paper. Another paper I've been working on, the South African entities that are getting money out of the Green Climate Fund, they've written this wonderful project, which is all to do with greenhouse gases and all to do with carbon emissions, etc. And it's actually just a huge work of a sleight of hand. They have to perform that to the Green Climate Fund, whereas actually the entire purpose of the project is just actually ways of crowding in the private sector to try to get them to essentially de-risk and to grow markets, etc. So it's just quite an interesting sort of observation that the private sector is kind of almost vilified in South Africa. They don't want to privatize energy, but equally this whole Green Climate Fund project is just one exercise in actually getting the private sector involved more. Anyway, thanks very much for the question.
Fantastic. We've managed to fill the whole hour and 45 minutes. We have 1 minute left, I think. If someone has a last burning question, we can squeeze it in. I look around, going once, going twice. I think it's gone.
I kept on thinking on Brock's question on hierarchies of power, but then thinking through what John just shared of this idea of how people cling to coal, etc. It is tempting to think of like state investment in concrete and steel road as more powerful than other forms of mobilization. But I think what John shared illustrates that ideas can be like break some new investments as well. So just not to idealize the idea that hard investment is more powerful than soft forms of infrastructure.
Okay. Thanks. I think on that note, we can conclude our session. Thanks everyone for the discussion, for the papers. Thanks to Jessica for making sure that we all come together and this gets organized and done. And I enjoyed the discussion.
And you too.
Nice panels. Yeah. And hope to see you all in other conferences, hopefully in person.